Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, everyone. Alex and I are here today to talk a little bit about self-criticism, knowing what an important theme this is, and it's come up on other episodes, and we've gotten feedback that this topic is very juicy and important for us to unpack a bit. So we thought we'd share a little bit about our own experiences and understanding of this idea of self-criticism and where it comes from and what it's all about and what we might do to help ourselves work through self-criticism so it's not so problematic or debilitating in our lives. So maybe, Alex, I can ask you, what's your kind of general sense of what self-criticism means?
My general sense is that internalized messages that the person has been conditioned to produce at various times, thinking either because they're conditioned or because the person thinks they're appropriate.
Yeah, it's good to start by thinking about where this criticism comes from. That the criticism comes from somewhere in our life, like we learned it somewhere, either in our families, growing up, in our schools, or maybe later in life at work or in romantic relationships, or, just by, encountering ideas and comparing ourselves against them and starting to get concerned whether we measure up and then criticizing ourselves if we feel that we don't. But right, oftentimes those messages start with criticism that we receive or at least perceive coming from other people who matter a lot to us in our lives.
Or what Daniel Ellenberg calls psychoosmosis is sort of in the atmosphere. You just internalize it.
Because it's in the culture, it's kind of around us in the media.
Right.
They sort of teach us to, how our body's supposed to look or how successful we're supposed to be or those sorts of messages all around us.
Yes. It seems like it's a natural process. Realizing that perhaps can take some of the self-blame out of it.
Like that there's something wrong with me for
criticizing myself.
For being, right. Let me criticize myself for being self-critical. That's a good start. Yeah. Okay. Right. So let's normalize the experience of self-criticism and say that it's something that we all do at some point. We almost can't not do it, given all the messages around us in the culture about various things. It can be difficult to avoid.
I've long found it puzzling, the whole discussion of the inner critic or self-criticism. So one aspect is that I have not always had clearly articulated sentences of criticism. More a sense that I'm being criticized. And I think I was reacting to that sense of being criticized. Not wanting to have that experience of being criticized.
So the experience of self-criticism can be words in our head that we're speaking to ourselves or things that we've heard other people say to us, like, come on, get it together, or hurry up, or you're not good at anything, or like, see, I told you you're bad at this, or like it can be kind of like a running commentary in our head, sort of actively criticizing us with sort of words and messages. But you're saying also it can be this experience of just kind of a bad feeling in your right, that it is the experience, the emotional experience of being criticized without necessarily always a narrative of a critic sort of talking to you.
And one thing I recently started to do is to, when I notice a feeling of being criticized, try to articulate what this thought would be if it were fully articulated. And I find that process somewhat painful. So maybe it's functioning as an exposure, but also allows me, not immediately, but start to distance myself from. So it's not, this isn't God's voice.
Right. So if you can start to get that feeling, become aware of that feeling, and then unpack where it's coming from and what that fear is or what what that critical thought would be if it had words, then you can kind of see, what are you up against? Is it that I'm looking in the mirror and feeling bad about how I look? Or is it that I'm aware of success and some milestone that I've not achieved, or some way that I've let someone down that I think, or whatever it might be? That, right, if you start to have that feeling, you might be able to sort of reverse engineer, where is this coming from? Yeah, what would the criticism be?
And it's curious to realize that the patterns. So like, oh, okay. So like now I'm at a point where it's like, well, probably these statements will be touched off by this action. Mm-hmm. It's kind of curious.
Can you give an example?
Just like you would express snow in the winter. Like, so when I weigh myself in the morning, that may touch off thoughts about my body or my eating practices.
Critical
thoughts, and I kind of know what those thoughts are.
Critical thoughts, I presume?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think we can relate. It's such a common thing, right? So now you're kind of getting the sense of like, oh, right, when I do these things, then that tends to touch off this kind of self-criticism.
And I think that intimacy and familiarity, there seems to be value to that because, yeah.
So it may be worth exploring the question of, what are my patterns of self-criticism? Like, what are the areas of life in which I'm likely to be more self-critical? Because for some of us, it'll be in some areas more than others. So starting to become more aware of that, whether it's, again, like a thought in your head saying, hey, you're no good, or whether it's just that feeling of, ugh, I feel criticized, I feel yucky, I know for me, when I have that experience, it's also, I've become much more aware of the self-criticism, the idea of self-criticism, when I started to look for signs of it in my emotions and in my feelings rather than like words in my head. And I know many, many people experience words in their head, right? Like, again, critical verbal thoughts, saying harsh things or making judgmental self-assessments. So that is a very common thing. I think for me, it does, like you're describing a little bit, it does tend to show up a little bit more without a lot of words and more just kind of like, gosh, why do I suddenly feel so like demoralized, or like, yeah, it's more of a feeling of demoralization or just frustration or impatience with myself, maybe. That's sort of a clue that some part of me is like holding me to some standard I'm not meeting, or like pushing me in some way that then, ends up creating like an opposing energy of like despair or frustration or just kind of exhaustion sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Because frequently the self-criticism results in fight, flight, freeze.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And aversive reactions and judgments, blame, fear, that's all in there.
Right. Yeah. Or just like in our daily life, when another person criticizes us, we may get defensive. I'm thinking about like in couples therapy, there's this idea of sort of criticism and defensiveness being a pair that often bounce back and forth together. One person feels criticized, they get defensive. And their defensiveness, they say something that makes the other person feel criticized. That person gets defensive. And, you just bounce back and forth, criticism and defensiveness. So in our mind, even all alone, if we're having critical thoughts, we may also end up kind of engaging in a self-defense sort of narrative in our mind, trying to talk ourselves up or say like, well, no, like it's okay. Or feel like we need to justify ourselves in some way, or justify why what we did is okay, or explain ourselves to ourselves in some way to try to put this sort of critical voice or part or feeling at ease, or sort of talk our way out of it.
It's interesting how we internalize patterns of interactions with significant early figures in our lives. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And sort of, it seems like we replay them in our heads almost. That's very curious.
Right. And because childhood is so full of learning and exploration, no one gets through childhood without making a mistake, or wanting to please, a teacher or a parent or somebody,
Right.
or feeling like we've let someone down, maybe a friend on the playground or whatever. Like we've all had that feeling of like, oh no, at some point in our early years. And the more pervasive that is, or the more toxic that is, the more of a problem it can become for us later on to internalize that. But the experience of it is just, I think, universal.
Right. And also it's interesting that there's also a healthy dynamic. So sort of the self-criticism seems to be an extreme unhelpful degree of an attempt at improving things, let's say, or producing quality work.
Yeah. So the critic does seem to, at least for me, I find it helpful to think that, okay, this criticism, misguided, but coming from a place of maybe trying to help. Maybe that's not true for everybody in all circumstances, but I think at least some of the time, maybe even a lot of the time for some of us, that criticism is really wanting us to do well, or like you said, wanting us to succeed in some way or meet some standard, or trying to hold us to be accountable to ourselves about various things. It's just that it's, again, like not super helpful. That's why I like the word misguided. Like the sort of self-critical part is sort of trying, to encourage us or push us to achieve some standard or do something, but it ends up not being encouraging, in a supportive, helpful, inspiring way. Instead, it feels sort of, demoralizing is the word that comes to mind for me.
Yes. And that's really good to realize, because there's a healthy dynamic that does make sense to move towards. So let's say producing quality work or being accountable in one's life. So that is not the problem. It's when it's turned up too much into a distorted zone that becomes problematic and counterproductive. So that's really helpful to realize.
Right, because it's rigid and the approach, at least, as I can relate to it, that the approach from the criticism is more harsh, right? Again, it's not like, I don't know, I'm thinking like an encouraging coach in like sports or something, right? If you had like a really good little league coach or a really good like soccer coach or something, they would really want you to excel, but they would do it from a place of enthusiasm, belief that you can, or wanting you to learn how, and being encouraging and supportive to inspire and motivate you, not from, oh, you're no good. Oh, just give up now. Quit while you're ahead. Like, this will never happen. All the kind of stuff that people experience from their inner critic. Even though I think the critic, again, is trying to often, not always, often trying to help you achieve some standard or get to somewhere that you maybe even really want to be some of the time.
Yeah, I think it's easy to confuse confuse that, and
I'm thinking about some of the ways that self-criticism shows up in people's lives that they may or may not be aware is really kind of a manifestation of self-criticism, right? Or like connected in some way to this self-criticism. So for instance, always being demanding of yourself about getting things done, right? Like being really task-oriented in a way that's a little bit aggressive, right? Like always sort of pushing to do more, never get through the to-do list on the day, that kind of thing. And then always feeling bad. And like, again, there's a critic inside you saying, well, you didn't get enough done today, or that sort of thing. Or just having really high standards and being kind of perfectionistic with yourself. Sometimes people think, oh yeah, I'm a perfectionist, or, oh, I like to be productive, but they don't necessarily realize that those things are very closely associated with pushing too much or too hard, or that there's a self-critic inside you there who's trying to kind of aggressively push you to be too productive, right? So you never achieve the standard. Your work is never perfect enough. So those are a couple that sort of come to mind. That again, I think, people may be able to identify, oh yeah, I'm kind of perfectionistic or what have you, but not necessarily realize, oh, that's really self-critical. Or I'm doing that in a way that's really harsh.
And I've heard the idea that the self-critical dynamic gets started quite early when the person is 2 years old. So it's not constructive criticism of a supportive coach, but rather a very young child's attempt.
Mm-hmm. There may also be ways that our tendency to be self-critical ends up kind of undermining our willingness to try things or do things and kind of making us feel helpless or powerless. We might feel like, oh, there's just no way, I could ever do anything. So I'm just going to not try or not take any risks to do that. Or similarly, like it might just like really take away our energy, right? Make us feel just really, maybe that's sort of what I was saying about being demoralized a little bit, just sort of takes away our inspiration a little bit, or our sense of vivaciousness or zest in some way. It just sort of sucks that away. And again, you might not necessarily realize there's a sort of a self-critical dynamic maybe hiding under that. But with a little bit of inquiry and self-reflection, we might find, oh, that's coming from a part of me that thinks there's no way I should even try. Or that's coming from a part of me that's like really disappointed that I didn't make the grade or achieve something that I was supposed to do or be or whatever. Or just guilt. That's another big one. Just, I hear a lot of people really, really struggling with guilt, and saying like, oh, when I feel guilt, good chance there's a self-critical thought process or impulse that's driving some of that. Right. I feel really bad that I didn't do this or that thing. And then you just really get down on yourself about it. But like you were saying, they all are coming from a place of wanting something better for yourself, or that there's, like, for instance, with guilt, like it's okay to have remorse. It's okay to feel bad about something that you did,
It's healthy.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's how we learn. We make mistakes and then we go, oh, I feel bad about that. I wish I had done something different. And then maybe we make an apology, or we apologize. At least we, forgive ourselves, and we set a goal for not doing that, whatever the thing was before. We feel remorse, regret. That is healthy. But then the critic keeps us trapped in that feeling of guilt, right? And so we just get sort of stuck spinning around in there.
It can also be, in my experience, confusing that since we internalize early interactions from our lives, so we feel critical, let's say, also we feel criticized. That can be confusing as well. Which one is it? Which one am I?
Meaning being critical of yourself or feeling criticized by others? Is that how you're...
Or rather criticized by myself.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say, so then it can be, if we think about ourselves as a unitary being, that's confusing to both experience criticizing and receiving the criticism and feeling guilty about it. So it's interesting that parts work has methods for identifying and making space for different dynamics and having them communicate peaceably,
right?
Which may not have happened in the role modeling relationships.
Right. So there's a part that is the self-critic, right? Always there, ready to wag their finger and make you feel bad. And then there's this other part of you that feels bad in response to that self-criticism. And so then that part also you might be noticing or feeling, like at any given moment. You might be more aware of just feeling that, oh, I feel so bad feeling of having been criticized, or you might be really feeling the irritation or impatience or frustration of the critic, that sort of self-critical part. I think, the feelings that you might be experiencing could be connected to either really being aligned with that critic and just being like, God, I really blew it. I'm so frustrated. Like, I'm no good at this. I knew I shouldn't have tried, or something like that, where you really wind yourself up getting really upset with yourself. Or you might just feel like, oh man, like I just can't do anything right. I feel so bad. I might as well not even try. And then there's that sort of despairing kind of quitting, giving up feeling, which is more the part that's been hurt by the criticism.
My experience is almost like getting into a traffic jam of sorts and not trying to work things out between these different dynamics. There's the self-criticism, which appears somewhat rational. There's some reasonable things in there. It's harsh, but then I also feel sort of like it just becomes a mess and I can't find myself out of it and give up, which is the freeze part, because I'm of fight, flight, freeze. So maybe thinking about ways we can help get ourselves out of this
get ourselves out of this traffic jam, get ourselves out of this mess we find ourselves in with this critic. So I think, as we were saying a few minutes ago, maybe starting off by just thinking, what kinds of ways do I know that this self-criticism is activated? What are the clues? Is it that I feel really angry and impatient with myself? Is it that I feel really demoralized and despairing? Is it, some of these dynamics I was describing, like really being very perfectionistic or, on a constant guilt trip or something? Like those are clues as well. So starting to tune into just how that self-critic even shows up for us. And then starting to figure out when that shows up, how we want to work with it. And I know that our longtime listeners know that we're big fans of self-compassion. So I'll make a pitch that self-compassion is really helpful in these moments, especially for both parts. If you could sort of step outside that criticizer pairing, right? And offer a little compassion to both, because they're both pretty unhappy in that moment, right? The one who feels criticized is feeling really hurt and dejected. And then that self-critic that you've got there, they're pretty unhappy too, so a little bit of compassion for all the players in the scene in our own mind would be helpful. So I guess that's a little bit of parts work too, thinking about these different parts of ourselves and what they need, offering some care and attention.
Mindfulness would have to be part of the solution.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're never going to be aware of what's even happening.
Right. Mm-hmm. As long as we're on automatic pilot.
Mm-hmm.
We're just playing out conditioning. So mindfulness, which of course is a certain kind of awareness, not just aware that I'm feeling guilty for not having done something, but also being aware that I'm not only feeling guilty and believing I'm bad, let's say, but realizing that these are mental formations that are taking place in my mind,
mm-hmm.
and not necessarily to be believed. The compassion piece certainly is also very helpful in terms of calming down the fight, flight, freeze, which seems like an essential part to be able to get the prefrontal cortex online, so that we can use our higher capacities, can reason through things, be creative. So it is a complicated dance.
How do we get that prefrontal cortex online so we can engage our higher thinking?
For instance, in the mindful self-compassion method, once we become aware that there is stress going on or distress happening in our bodies, then starting to tend to ourselves. So getting the mammalian dynamics online so that we are starting to feel soothed. And there are a bunch of tools for that in terms of speaking to oneself with a kind voice, things like touching oneself in ways that evoke kindness. It's no wonder tool. This is quite difficult to work out, especially if the strings have been over tightened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that brings up a couple things. One is I'm thinking about how easy it is for us to align with our self-criticism and to really believe that the self-critic is right. Right. I really am no good, or I really need to meet that perfect standard, or else. So just to note that it's really hard to even loosen that grip a little bit. So I like your suggestion about these are all just thoughts, right? Almost it's mindfulness, but also from a Buddhist tradition of just these are mental formations, these are not reality, and finding a way to sort of at least not be totally kind of enmeshed or fused with that critical part. So we can have some healthy skepticism of what those messages are that we're getting from that intense self-criticism. Maybe I don't need to feel as guilty, or maybe perfect isn't the standard I should be aiming for, or I don't know, maybe all of this is unnecessary, sort of thinking that isn't actually helping me live a better life in the long term. So being a little dubious about that, and trying to just soften it a little bit. I mean, I realize that can be a very challenging thing to try to do if we're so used to trying to be perfect. We might want to explore why that is. Are we trying to earn love? Are we trying to achieve something that means will give us some other thing that we think it's like the only way to achieve or something, like the only way I'm going to achieve self-confidence is if I'm perfect, or the only way I'm going to be a worthy human being is if I'm perfect, or loved, I have to be perfect, all that stuff. So starting to unpack that a little bit is good. But also maybe worth noting that for some of us, that it's not just that we end up being really perfectionistic or feeling guilty all the time, or, some of those other things we were describing. But sometimes people sort of rebel against the inner critic, and they kind of won't do anything or try anything. And they'll get sort of reckless or sloppy, or just like, hey, like, I'm not playing this game, but then you sort of jump to the other extreme of just sort of quitting on yourself, or quitting on goals, or quitting on, whatever standard the inner critic is trying to push you to achieve. Like procrastination maybe can fall into that pattern, where you're just sort of like, I give up, or like, I'm not doing this, which I get totally, because that self-criticism can be like a real downer, and who wants to hang out with that energy? So that's another thing maybe to sort of be tuned into when we're looking for signs of self-criticism. Am I just procrastinating a lot, or just sort of giving up, or just being careless about things? Because I'd rather do that than be held to a standard.
Right. I can totally see that. Or being very...
I mean, there's other reasons any of that could show up, but this may be one of them.
Or being very controlled through much of the day with food, let's say.
Oh, and then like, woohoo, like party time, let's eat up, right? And then like overeating and just sort of giving in to the indulgence
that's also confusing to understand the connection between the attempt at over control and then not being responsible. So
letting it all hang out.
I suppose goes back to this, So it's a very curious dynamic, and a bit like that act metaphor comes to mind, the so-called Chinese finger puzzle, where you're able to free your fingers not by pulling them apart, but pushing them together, sort of like by lessening the tension in the system. Very counterintuitive.
Right. Yeah. To sort of stop the efforting, but also to stop again, like if you're somebody who's doing the opposite and you're just indulging and not trying at all, then you might need to, it's more about the sort of finding a balance in the system.
What the setting is for the individual.
So knowing ourselves, knowing where we fall on this sort of continuum or this pattern of self-criticism. So how does self-criticism show up for me? Does it show up with words and critical thoughts? Does it just show up in a sort of energy feeling of like being criticized and that yucky feeling? How does it show up? What are some of the clues? Am I guilty all the time? Do I feel like helpless? Am I, perfectionistic or like addicted to productivity, or do I do the opposite? Am I sort of reckless or self-indulgent, or kind of procrastinate everything because I don't want to play that game? We might do a little bit of all these things in different areas of our lives at different times. But the more we become aware that, oh, look at this, like this is all connected to, sort of too tight, too loose reactivity to this inner critical experience of criticism, then we can try to adjust our settings, as we were saying, give ourselves some self-compassion and, some kindness, and to help settle our energy down and get into that, body state of relaxation to help the whole thing go more easily. And then like figure out where's that middle ground, or like, where do I need to move the settings, inside here so that I commit myself to doing what I need to do. Like you were saying, producing quality work, but not being a perfectionist and not procrastinating or just saying, who cares, right? Sort of not falling on the other end of the continuum either. Or like you're saying, like not over controlling like everything you eat or like all sources of pleasure, but not just kind of throwing caution to the wind and giving up anything, any awareness of, wanting to eat well or be healthy. Or similarly, like with guilt, like we were saying, it's okay to feel regret and to sort of set a goal to aspire to behave better in the future or do something different. That would be useful guilt. So figuring out and starting to slowly over time, because these things got baked in early for a lot of us in our early lives. So like slowly over time, starting to notice those patterns and just pull off like 10%, 20%, like, just moving it's a little bit like, what do they say? Turning around the Titanic, that expression, like, but also like tiny adjustments make a big difference in the long term. Like with
tanker.
boats, what's that thing where like if you move the wheel like 5 degrees, just a very small amount, but then like in 1,000 miles, you'll be way in a different place. So over the really long term, like a very small shift can take you in a very different path.
I mean, it's no wonder we humans have difficulty with these things, because it is quite complex and perhaps in some ways counterintuitive. And then if we have been conditioned to get stuck in fight, flight, freeze, ruminate, or have worry thoughts and so on, then it takes quite a bit of skill to navigate this. And those skills need to be developed, and that awareness needs to be developed.
So giving some love and care to our self-critical part that's trying to help us, as well as love and care to all these other parts of ourselves that react to that experience of criticism. And then also if we feel inspired to try to gradually make shifts to that pattern over time, can be really fruitful, even if it seems small in the long term.
I'm struck by how
quite big.
The prescription, as it were, always seems to be to make friends, to hear more from various dynamics, and sort of create a peaceful internal environment where everyone is being heard and sort of being attended to in a loving way.
Yeah, I think the sort of traditional cognitive behavioral therapy metaphor that gets used is the idea of having a committee in your head, right? And you're trying to hear everyone on the committee, right? But not give them all power, sort of. So thinking about, well, okay, I hear you. And, and there's like lots of different points of view, right, on that committee, people with very different perspectives, all trying to sit together and negotiate. But I think some of the more current thinking is around sort of the idea of a family more, right? Like internal family systems and other parts work, encourages you to relate to each other in your head, all these different parts, not just as like members of a committee, but really, like you're saying, as a family who cares about each other. And we're trying to, sort of really hear each other out and help all these different parts feel cared for. But also like have a part of us that establishes some kind of leadership who can, sort of at the end of the day, be the one to sort of decide, what are we doing here? Yes, okay, there's this part that feels very hurt by the critic. There's this very critical part, but can we activate this other more central self to select and choose a path forward that is compassionate to those other voices, but can guide us in a way that's ultimately going to be more healing.
Wonderful contribution to one's quality of life and to the world, one's family. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Alex. This has been a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate exploring this topic and theme with you. I hope it was helpful to all of you out there having a listen. And if you are interested in exploring this and other topics further, don't forget to join our Facebook group or hop over to noblemindpodcast.com and hop on our email list as well. Look forward to connecting with you down the line. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.